Good afternoon. Welcome to the People Experience Hub podcast. I'm here today joined by two amazing guests from the company Freeformers, but rather than me butcher introductions, as I so often do, Toby, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, so I'm Toby. I'm a co-founder of Freeformers. Emily is the other co-founder. I don't want a spoiler alert.
No.
Emily's the other co-founder.
Emily, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. That was really smooth, Toby. Hi, I'm Emily Forrest. I am the other co-founder of Freeformers.
And there's only two.
There's only two.
It's just us
Okay, the pair of you together.
We are one founder.
We are but two halves of a single unit.
Yes.
Well, interesting that you say that because, like, jokes aside, honestly, yes. Like, my advice to anybody, if you're going to go into business with somebody else, find somebody who is the exact opposite of you, because Toby brings a showmanship, tells a story, it's fantastic at influencing people, fantastic at really, like, bringing people to life. And then when I'm being nice to myself, I'm like, and I do all the work.
Stunning. So look, before we maybe get into like what you guys do, actually, where did Freeformers begin? How did this whole process begin for you guys?
So Freeformers began in August of last year when I had an idea about designing the future of work and was really... Myself and Emily worked in learning and development for, I'm about 15 years, you're about 10, 12 years. 10? 10. And we've always applied like human-centered design to learning initiatives, but it kind of was a little bit pointless because you got all this kind of great insight and then designed some training as a result. And like, with all that great insight, you should be designing just like a better employee experience. There's so much information you get out of that process that the answer isn't going to be a 2-hour webinar. It's going to be fixed stuff to do with your employees. And then we tried to look for companies that did that, and they didn't exist. So we're like, okay, well, we'll do that. We'll apply human-centered design to employee experience. But that really wasn't enough because like no one's doing that, if that makes sense. There's not a marketplace for that kind of stuff at the moment. And so then we had to look at a measurement model to kind of go, okay, well, how do you prove that treating people better makes your company more money?
Because it sounds obvious.
It does,
when
right?
we actually say it out loud, I talk to people, I'm very privileged, I get to talk to lots of HR folk, and like the idea that, you know, treating people well improves productivity or retention or any of those like outcome-y things it seems very self-evident to me, but it still feels like we're building business cases for it, which I think is kind of bizarre in 2024.
Yeah. Which is where we came with the concept of mutual lifetime value. It's like, can you measure the amount of value you give people and the amount of value they give you? And what's the ratio between those two things and track that ratio over time? Yeah. Like, and we kind of say to each other every week, it's like, why has no one figured this measurement out before? Because I think we get too lost in the kind of the traditional HR metrics, like, attrition and speed to competency and all these kind of things. But actually, ultimately, a business owner or a business leader wants their company to make more money. So how do you do that? Well, you can try loads of different things, but we believe that by treating people better, your company will make more money, and we think that we've stumbled across a way of proving that.
So that's actually a great like sort of segue into what does Freeformers do then? What makes it different from, I guess, like other kinds of consultancy you might look at?
So what makes us different is that we are data-led. We balance that out with human insights as well. So when we work with a business, or let's say we're working with an HR team, we'll be like, okay, how do we start benchmarking the value of your employee experience? How are we looking at the commercial metrics, like the financial metrics? Because some people are, and some people really definitely aren't, and have never like even considered that there should be a financial element to it. So what benchmarks can we create? And we're looking at other metrics across the whole employee experience lifecycle as well, like some of those more traditional ones that you mentioned, like retention, attrition, all of those kind of things. We're also interested in looking at, as I said earlier, the whole employee experience lifecycle, or as we call it, the true employee experience lifecycle, which starts before somebody signs a contract, before they're a candidate, at the first moment when they even consider you as a potential employer.
When they like come on your website maybe, or first like even hear about the business.
When you first hear about you, like, I think it's when you consider them as an employee, but sometimes we discuss, and Toby's like, well, actually no, because if you think about customer brand as well, like knowing a good customer, so like, I'm really into like all my outdoors stuff, so knowing a business, let's say, oh God, panic.
Mountain Warehouse.
I didn't want to say, okay, no. I didn't want to say Patagonia because everyone goes with that, but let's say Patagonia because they certainly had a really good business model.
Very sexy brand too.
Right, and so that's already maybe priming you to say, actually, I'd be more likely to want to work there because their customer brand, their values agree with me. I'd be more likely to want to apply for a job there. Yeah. So if it starts there, Or where does it end? Because so many people are just like, right, you're off, bye, see you later. And like the moment your employment contract ends is at the very end of it. But we're like, well, no, because ultimately you can still be offering an awful lot of brand. Let's say Patagonia again, you can still be shopping there. You could be encouraging people to apply for jobs there. You could be encouraging your friends and family, whoever, to go and buy, to go and shop there as well.
You move into the like, advocacy space and alumni
Absolutely.
in that sense, but like actually you see like long-term customer value is like, I know it's a big thing like Amazon, for example, obsessive over. Like, well, it's not about the individual things. Well, you get a great refund, right, when you have a problem or anything. They just throw stuff at you because they know you'll keep coming back for more, and over time it makes sense.
And that makes sense for employers too. And we're talking around it, but we might as well just spell it out. Like fundamentally, we believe that there is like a crossover between the marketing funnel and the employee experience lifecycle. So you start with awareness, like where you're aware of your company, and I'm gonna get these in the right order. Consideration is kind of maybe if you're thinking like your recruitment, you're considering them as an employer. Conversion, maybe you're starting your employment. You're getting through to loyalty. You're loyal. You're having a really good time. You're really engaged as an employee. And then when you leave advocacy, you're still an advocate for that company.
Interesting. And so like the business is kind of based on that model, or your framework, I guess, is what was the name of the model? Sorry, you called it before.
Mutual lifetime value.
Mutual lifetime value. And what makes it so like? Let's just break that down. Actually, is because like while it is unique, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the other things you guys do. What the word mutual in there? What's that referring to?
So you come back to your point about, you mentioned kind of customer lifetime value.
Yeah.
So that's a term I picked up whilst I was working at O2 with their marketing team. They were just implementing customer lifetime value to do kind of measure everything they were doing. And I was like, oh, cool. Well, I'm over here in HR. Can we apply that same thinking to HR? And then looked it up, and employee lifetime value was a thing. So employee lifetime value as a metric is good. How much value you're getting out of your people through the length of that relationship. But what no one was measuring was employer lifetime value, like the opposite. How much value are you giving your people through the length of that relationship? So both of those metrics by themselves are really interesting, but where we found kind of the more interesting stories in how you look at the ratio between those two, and that's why we called it mutual lifetime value, how much value you're giving and getting, mutual value.
Right.
So because I think traditionally every HR team starts from a position of like, oh, how much value can we give our people? How much experience can we give our people? Which is absolutely the right thing to do. But as a business case, if you can't directly correlate that with the output, then why do you exist? Because your HR team typically doesn't sit with an organisation just to make the employee experience as good as it can be. Even though it probably should, it needs to be able to prove its value in doing so. And that's where we kind of use it as our entry point to consultancy. It's like, well, let's make sure we understand what value you're offering at the moment and getting. And then when we do anything, we can measure the difference.
That's so interesting. So, like, where do you start then? So you've got, and actually, let's talk about the measurement piece. I'm very interested in measurement professionally, as you can probably imagine, given what we do at the People Experience Hub. But so how do you go about conducting? Let's start with the employee measurement. How do you go about measuring the value that an employee is bringing to a business?
First of all, you've got to think, what are people really interested in? What is value, right? And so we're going to start with it in terms of pound signs, dollar signs, whatever. We're going to start looking at the financial, commercial value, because that's what your business owner is really interested in. And that's how you're going to be demonstrating, to use the slightly corporate language, that your HR is a profit center, not a cost center.
Yeah.
Right? So you're looking at your financial metrics. So you can look at so they're financial metrics there. And then there's other things that are really, really key, because commercials aren't everything. If you're just prioritizing commercials, then obviously you end up at the risk of alienating your people. You're chasing profits over people. You're going to end up with a lot of churn, people not feeling valued and not feeling appreciated. So other key metrics that are really important for us are looking at tenure, so how long you're staying with a business. And it's really interesting. There's absolutely a bell curve in the data showing that the amount of time that you spend with a company and then how engaged you are as well. There absolutely is. It's fascinating. So like when you've been there for like a certain amount of time, you're going up, right? You're going up in your bell curve, and like it's great, and time is going great, and you're really engaged. But then when you get to a certain point, and it does differ per industry, but then you're coming down again on the other side, and then people stop being engaged. And so you find the people who've been in a place for 10 years or more, like they're really not, which obviously like intuition tells us is fairly obvious, but they're really not engaged at all. So that's really interesting. So tenure, general engagement, we look at different engagement scores that we use. They're really important as well. but also the financials is what differentiates us and what no one's looking at.
There's a really uncomfortable truth, and I find this when I talk to HR people, as human resources.
Yeah.
The title in and of
Yep.
itself is complex, right? When you actually break it down, because we don't really like talking about people as commodities and commoditizing the human condition. It seems a very strange thing. People want to go to work and like, we were talking about this just on the way in, like purpose and meaning and those sorts of things. But actually we live in a capitalist society, and I think there is an agreement and a covenant that you have when you go to work about going, I must provide a value for a value. Like, it is an agreement. I get paid for a service, and therefore your business is trying to optimize how much it can get out of you in a sense.
Yeah, and I think we have this conversation quite a few times in that, like, this isn't about whether you agree with capitalism or not.
Right.
Like, capitalism isn't going to go anywhere.
Well, we're in it, right? Whether you like it or not. we're
Exactly.
here.
So, regardless of how aspirational you might be to, change the employee-employee relationship, realistically, it is built on a capitalist model. So you have to be able to measure it in a capitalist way, and that's just how the world works.
Measure the resource of human, right? That's which is what we're doing.
It might feel icky, it might feel, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Like, and to try and go far away from that is just to go la 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 la. This is not existing. Like, it's happening.
But I also think that kind of leads to a thing that a lot of HR people tell us. Like, so I ran a webinar talk on Friday with a group of HR people, mostly internal HR, and a lot of them were just saying, like, oh, well, why should we have to prove our value? But there's that kind of that feeling there, like, well, why aren't we respected like finances? I'm like, well, because finance is proving their value already.
So I've worked in sales for a long time, right? And like
Yeah.
one of the things is if you're not hitting your numbers in sales, you ain't staying in sales for very long.
But it's true in
harder-
everything. Like,
because it's easy, you can see the numbers on the page, right?
It's true in absolutely everything. Like,
Yeah.
no one is going to tell your story for you. You have to tell your story, and you have to be the one shouting about it.
100%. So you look at then, so we take this kind of commercial stance of like measuring employee value. How then do you go about measuring it the other way, that the value that an employee receives from their employer?
Oh, we're looking at me, are we?
Yeah, look at you.
So there are. So you're kind of looking at the flip side of it. So however you calculate it, however we are calculating it for our employees, we want to be looking at it for employers to make sure that there is a way that we can work those two numbers together. Because if you're collecting them in completely different ways, then they're just not valid at all.
Sure.
So again, the word lifetime's in there. So again, we're looking at tenure and a whole load of lifetime. When we work with clients, we actually are looking at, okay, from the beginning to the end of the whole employee experience life cycle, like I said before. But also obviously acknowledging that some of them just do it from, recruitment. Also, it's even contract date to leaving date.
Sure.
But again, you're looking at the financial performance, and you can go and break it down by, depending on how big you are, you can look at it by teams, you can look at the revenue of different teams, that's part of it. But obviously, that's not all of it at all. You need to be also looking at, like, how your people are feeling. We're talking employer here, yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking employer. So how people are feeling, you're looking at the value of benefits and all of those things. These are all those kind of...
So the total reward statement comes into that, or...
Often, yeah. So it depends on the size of the business, it really does. Like, we've worked with the smallest company we've done this for have been 33, I think they were, 33 people. So obviously they don't have all of that stuff in place, but they still have certain things in place, certain benefits in place. And then you also have to take into account how people are feeling. Those things like that belonging piece, all of those kind of things are all really important, are part of the value as well.
You must use surveys. I know, like, I'm not going to wax lyrical about surveys today too heavily, but you must use some survey data for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So our initial point is not to use surveys, is to capture the financial data, because that's kind of hard and fast. That's not like,
That's
we
facts,
said,
not opinion.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But what we love to do is then, as Emily said, right, augment it with the human stuff. So whether that's focus groups, interviews, and surveys, to kind of bring some of that stuff in as well, and tell that as a holistic message. Whereas I think HR typically tends to be HR first. Of course, it does. Tends to be survey first. If we look at pulse surveys as an example, like, that's our metric for evaluating year-on-year performance. And like, it's not really good enough, is it? Because if any other department in the organisation was proving its value by an annual survey and moving against that annual survey, they'd probably get laughed out of the boardroom.
Sales, for example, right? So sales, you've worked in sales.
Yeah.
Toby's worked in sales for ages as well. Like, if you just said, oh, we've surveyed our customers and this is what we think. If your only metric was like, NPS or something along the lines of customer satisfaction kind of things, like, you wouldn't, like, you need the hard numbers as well to make the case. And that's absolutely where we think surveys are important. They have their place. But The problem with the way that they're implemented so often is they're long. They're never anonymous. They are absolutely never.
I will say
anonymous.
ours are.
Okay.
I would
all
just
right,
say.
all right, all right, all right.
But this is why we like you.
No, but so, it's interesting. Well, I'm actually curious on your opinion of why you think surveys are never anonymous.
Okay,
I feel like this is a great time.
There is a perception inside an organisation because you're getting email reminders. Why haven't you filled in your survey yet? Please fill in
From
your
single
survey.
sign-on, right? Yeah.
From single sign-on. Please fill in your survey. Please fill in your survey.
Hear this all the time, and it's a really big problem, like in the industry around survey, because it is part of the nuance of the thing. Because if you don't feel like it's going to be anonymous,
Then you're not going to answer honestly.
You're not going to give the truth, right? And what we're seeking, we're trying to. I mentioned about facts and opinions. This is like one of my big talking points, like on this sort of podcast, because it comes up all the time. Everyone is seeking facts. Most people get opinions. For anything that we're trying to do. And you guys are in the same kind of boat by the sounds of things. And the problem with opinions is that they're really easy to come by. Everyone's got them. And, there's lots of analogies we can do about unpleasant things. We're not going to do that here. In order for surveys to kind of move into that space, you're dead right. Like, the anonymity piece must be there, but it just is so hard to do. But then equally, it's great. You're going to miss that sentiment data, right? Because that's when you're talking about how people feel about their employer. That's going to be the core thing. How would you do that outside of surveys? Is then my next question.
Well, you can measure it by the action. So it's to kind of go, okay, what does a highly engaged employee do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year basis that demonstrates that they're highly engaged? And there are a multitude of data sources in the company that HR typically doesn't look at, people's emails, people's calendars. There's a whole host of activity. Now, there are data privacy issues in there. So you've got to balance this kind of world between Big Brother and not Big Brother, right? Yeah. So I'm just going to describe the Big Brother world because that's
before I ask your opinion, talk to me about this.
This is where the balance comes in, right? Because if I had zero moral compass, you kind of go, well, all the platforms an employee engages with capture data about how they're using it and their performance on that platform, right? And how many platforms do companies have? 10s, 20s, 30s in some cases, or even more?
176. According to, there was a survey, I did this on Friday in my talk, there was a survey, the average business of 500 employees has 176 apps.
Stop it.
No, I'm for real. I can't talk to the validity of the survey, but that is on the internet as a source.
So, because the obvious one is like Microsoft, right? You could count that as one, but I know it's not. Like, there's the Teams, Forms, Word, Excel, like all SharePoint, all of the different apps within that. But you're saying on average, a business with 500 people, 172 applications.
Yeah, I can believe it. We just done work with a company bigger, to be fair, but we just looked at their HR space and we mapped out all their systems. So we mapped out their ecosystem of their whole HR and all of their systems, and they had 25, I think, 26 different systems just in HR that they're using, across the whole of HR.
But also 3 or 4 doing surveys as well. So there's they were doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on the same function across various platforms, which was a bit weird.
You actually, as a sidebar, you see that a lot with survey stuff because it's such a technically easy thing to bolt on.
Yeah.
You see it like HRIS all the time, right? There's comes with a built-in survey platform, and we could talk about why that's a good thing and a bad thing, but it gives you loads of challenges around anonymity to start with. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right as well. All these, so let's say it's 30 platforms, right? Let's say it's 176 for fun, but you're absolutely right. Each one is tracking and measuring your activity. Anyway, they are doing that because that's what technology is designed to do. It's what Instagram has been doing Facebook has been doing for 20 odd years.
Yeah.
It's not new. It's not a novel concept.
And what I'm not doing, I'm not doing the wiggle my mouse so I look active. How many active hours have they had at work? That's pointless information. But actually, when you look at community building, Microsoft Teams is just a community building platform, really, with a few other bits and bobs attached to it. But what conversations are you in? How many chats are you in? How many one-on-ones? How many one-to-manys? How many group chats are you in? How many channel? I forget Teams language because we're now a Google organization.
Strong.
But yeah, channels? Is it channels?
I think it's channels.
We don't use Teams.
I'm on Teams and I'm pretty sure it's channels.
The bits down the left-hand side. Where everyone clicks.
These groups? Stuff. I'm not sure. Someone please correct me when they in the comments of this somewhere.
#Teams.
You think they'll call it Teams? Yeah.
Podcast brought to you by Microsoft.
Yeah,
But all of that is indicative data about how you're engaging with the work, with the organisation, and then you can go next level and kind of go, okay, how many times are you chatting? What messages are you sending? How long are the messages?
What was the sentiment of this message?
Yeah, and that is, for my money, too far, and that's saying something because Everybody knows it. Like, you could Zuckerberg it, right? You could just be Big Brother and look at absolutely everything that platform was, people were doing on that platform. I'm not saying do that, but I'm also saying don't just disregard it either. Like, there's a multitude of data that you can capture from that and kind of go, okay, well, what do our high performers, what do the low performers, mid performers look like, and actually what does the engagement with that platform look like? And all of a sudden, you're analysing human behaviour. And this is what, genuinely, Facebook is really good at and also really bad at, is that it knows what you like, what you do, when you do it, where you've been. Now there's massive trust issues, so people are flocking away from it, right? But they were really good at capturing that data and then serving marketeers content.
It's a MarTech play, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
The marketing technology world has absolutely exploded with this over the last 10 years. I know a couple of my friends work in that space. It is insane what they can glean from your online behavior. And it's how they connect it together that is so fascinating to me. Like, and at work it's even easier in a sense, because we said single sign-on quite flippantly before, but actually it is your unique way of being tracked, right? It is the way in which you exist. My Microsoft login is my single source of truth, and everything I do, every application I use, I log in through that, which is great. It's nice and easy for me, but it means that my boss, and Nick, if you're listening, like, I know, I don't think you're watching, but you can. I know you can if you want to.
But it's interesting because you've got that single sign-on, and we use our Google single sign-on to access literally any other kind of third-party piece of software, which you could then even look at how many apps. We've not done this, but maybe we should. How many apps have you logged into, and how many apps am I logged into?
Far fewer than you, because I don't use that. Because it's not the most secure way of doing it.
But that's quite interesting in itself. And like, okay, what apps are your people using that ordinarily don't sit within the organisation? What are they going out to go and get? There's a whole host of the benefit of having a remote or hybrid workforce is that you start using the technology more than you do having in-person stuff. So therefore, you can measure it. And it's just like, lean into it ever so slightly. I'm not saying go Big Brother, but just...
Yeah, so if we park the moral quandary of, like, where's the line? Because, like, we could talk about that for hours. Like, what I'm really hearing, though, is, like, you could probably be sensitive and take stuff... And at least, I suppose, so long as you're being forthcoming with your employees about what you are capturing.
And why.
And
what
why
you're
you are
gonna do
doing
with
it.
it.
Right, that then, taking that information, combining it with maybe some sentiment information that you gather and layering that then over the other piece that we talked about, like the employer-based stuff, like, actually then gives you this really interesting comparison piece, right?
It does. And the other thing I want to come back to is, you asked what would you do instead of surveys. I think lean in the other way. The thing with surveys is people do them because they're quick. Conceivably, they scale. You can reach lots of people quickly, right? And you can get quant data out of it. You can get people giving you a number or a Likert scale, and it's really easy to do a comparison. But if you've got all this additional quant data, like numbers that you can get from platforms, then what we often do is lean into the whole survey thing. Not survey. I did not say that. Oh my gosh, I just said that. We lean into the whole interview side of it, of the user research, and really dig down and understand the why. Because surveys, they so often tell you what's happening, but they don't tell you why it's happening. Yeah. And so if you really want to understand, and you've got all this behavioural data as well, then actually go and segment your audience, find out your personas, who are they, different people, go and really dig down and find out why they're doing what they're doing, or why what's happening is what's happening.
Yeah, super. So look, that's kind of your framework. I know it's not the only thing you guys touch on, because I think when I first came across Sophie, candidly, like, the thing I first saw about him was the wrestling thing, which
we don't do that.
You don't. Well, you don't.
We're not a wrestling company yet.
Well, not yet. We could. Hey, I never say never. But some of the stuff you were talking about, and the things that really captured my attention, was about how you talk about communicating and being more of like a sort of social leader at work. How does that kind of influence your work, and how does that kind of work in your world of work?
So it's no coincidence that everything that we've just talked about takes inspiration from the world out of work. So if we think about, we just talked about Facebook and their data methodology on tracking and understanding user behavior and bringing that into work. So when we look at communicating inside the workplace, we've done exactly the same, and we've looked at, and it took a while for me to convince Emily that this was a good idea, but we looked at the world of esports content creators, not necessarily competitive esports players, but the content creation side of it, and what they do, because essentially, in terms of leadership skills, they go from 0 followers to hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of followers. Okay, so how do you do that in a digital world? That's really interesting to me, because leaders at inside companies have to now lead in a virtual world, but they're almost given followers. And I say followers very loosely because they're given people who could be followers. Yeah. So a leader has to kind of get this group of potential followers to actually follow them. in person, traditionally over the past 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, like that's been the in-person experience. But now we have to do that digitally and in person if we're doing hybrid, right? So the world outside of work has moved far, far quicker in this space than the world inside of work. And that's demonstrated not only by the platforms like Twitch and Discord, but it's also demonstrated by, the under 30s primarily crafting out a living by creating followerships from zero. And you're like, that's
the job title of influencer, if you like, right? Which is a relatively new concept.
So this is where I get slightly annoyed.
Oh, okay. Oh, here we go. We're getting into the good stuff now.
If you're considering, not you specifically, but if you're considering something like an influencer as a new concept or job, then you're already probably quite far behind because it's been around for quite a while. And we're talking like 10, maybe even 15 years in its very early infancy. So it's not really new anymore, but people inside the world were, oh, TikTok, oh, influencers, they're new. No, they're not. They've progressed much quicker than they have inside the world.
I think we've never talked about this before because influence goes way back. Like, you just have to look in, like, Paris in the 1600s about what the Queen was wearing at court and then what everybody else started wearing, right? Like, that whole influence thing, it's definitely not a new idea.
It's definitely
the mode is a little new. They didn't have TikTok.
They didn't have technology to enable that to happen. But leaders inside of organisations haven't figured out how to do it through technology. It's like, how do I do what I do in terms of my leadership skills in person and apply them to a virtual environment? How do I run a Teams or Zoom meeting like I would run it in person? No, that's rubbish. That doesn't make any sense. Actually, how do you engage an audience through a live stream, like streamers do, or esports content creators, influencers, social media content creators, whatever you want to call them, because they're able to do that. And not only are they able to do it, like, they don't have the cameras on all the other people. They just have a chat feed. And they're able to do 1, 2, 3, 4 hours of highly engaged content with an audience and make money out of it. And you're like, well, leaders have kind of now lost their way in that they think they can host a 1 hour meeting through Zoom and kind of go, well, everyone will be engaged because they're at work.
Well, so maybe this is part of the conundrum that most leaders find themselves in 2024, right? Like, I hate using the post-pandemic as a word, but it did all flip, right? Like, I went to the office 5 days a week and now I don't. Things change. The challenge I see put before is in exactly that space, which is the one you've identified. If you traditionally, leaders have a captive audience. If they wanted to give a talk, town hall, whatever, you just got people in a room and you spoke to them. And generally speaking, when people are in a room, it is easy to engage them. Like, generally speaking, like, yes, you can be bored, but by putting people together, there is this natural thing. Humans like being together. It is a nice experience. When you do it in a remote setting and you put someone at home where they don't have to have their camera on, you're competing with their TV. Which is a far more engaging thing than they're probably getting from the work. So the level of competition is so much higher. Therefore, the work you need to put in, and this was my observation over the last few years, the work you need to put into your online presentation needs to be so much higher. You need to start thinking. I've been advising and I talk to people about thinking about it like broadcast, because that's really what you're doing. You're like broadcasting TV. Businesses still find it really complex as an idea. Like, I just dial in from my phone, or, we talked the other day. I mean, we were talking about where you sit and where your camera is.
And you can see up someone's nose still, or just the top of their head.
Or you're not being able to hear them quite properly, or any of those sorts of things. They sound really trivial and aesthetic in nature, but actually it's to do with the core experience that a person has.
Yeah, and we looked at some research, not that we did, but that someone else did, and 19 out of the top 20 Instagram influencers look directly into the camera.
So this is a really interesting one. You coach people on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that would be one of the tenements I would imagine that you would look at. So when you're addressing the room, rather than looking... I have a really bad habit. I'm sure most of you, most people at home will know about this, but looking at yourself when you're talking, right? But you're looking at the wee little square on your screen, in the bottom right. Actually, the engaging thing for the viewer, as you say, is to look down the lens. TV people have known this for years. Look at the camera, don't look at the other presenter. You convert your... I should be looking up here. I say this. If you're listening to this, I'm so sorry you won't really get the vibe. But all of a sudden, I'm staring down the camera lens, and it's probably a bit eerie for the podcast vibe. But it's true though. It makes for a more engaging experience when you're looking at the person.
Yeah, 100%. And to Emily's point, not only looking up someone's nose, but it's you're looking down on someone. And so that perception is that what you want to try and do as much as possible is recreate the in-person experience. And with a laptop, you can't do that because the camera is not where you're not looking at the camera, and also it is way down. Like, you're not talking to people like that when you're at work, right? And again, technology has caught up with this. If you look at Elgato, a kind of a German kind of content creation accessory company, they have created an add-on for their camera now, which is essentially a little mirror that now, like an auto cue, right?
Yeah.
So instead of it being an auto cue with words, which it can be, that's where you put your Zoom call or your Teams call, you put it up there. So you're now looking at your content at the camera.
Which makes a lot more sense. I've seen two other variants of this. One is a camera that comes down in front of the monitor.
Yeah.
So you get with a little plunger on it, it sticks onto the screen, so you're looking at that, which I thought was fine, but I found a bit obtrusive. The one that I found particularly odd, I'm sure you've both seen this, is the AI eyes. Have you seen this?
No, I haven't.
So it's a piece of augmented reality technology whereby it scans your eyes ahead of time, and then when you're on the stream or talking to someone, it changes them. So like they're always looking, makes them look like they're always looking at the camera lens. It's a very, very strange experience to see. Like you can kind of tell, but you can it's not that obvious. Like if you didn't know what to look for, you wouldn't notice it. But it's there.
Okay, so it's not like it detracts from the whole experience then, or it does.
I mean,
It does.
It does.
It's
Okay.
Have you've seen it? Right?
Yeah, it makes me feel creepy.
No, it's a little eerie, but it's actually it's probably a better use of augmented reality that I've seen. But it is a little.
Well, the problem is when you're in an in-person experience, what you don't just constantly do is make consistent eye contact with someone. You don't just look at them consistently.
Without blinking.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Where it's massive too.
So-
And tapping.
With your headlights turned around, right?
It's a little bit unnerving, right? So the AI solution there isn't really going to work for you. I think the YouTuber that we work with, the Gara Show, he doesn't always look at the camera, but when he does it with intent.
Yeah.
He's got several monitors. He's looking at chat. So hey, I'm just looking at chat here, and then he brings himself back. And that's how we've had this conversation now. So it's like you don't have to, as you would in person. What's the middle ground? Don't just stare at the people on the camera. That's weird. But also, give yourself that opportunity to look away. But also, at least have your camera on and in the right place and with some lighting and stuff like that.
A half decent background, I think.
Yeah.
Tidy the floor or whatever it is. Like, not everyone is so blessed to have a beautiful office or anything like that, right?
But the blurred backgrounds do the absolute opposite of what they create mistrust. It's like, what are you hiding behind that blurred background? It's like, what would be better is even just up against a wall with a plain wall of any colour, it would be absolutely fine. And generally, when I've worked with people and they've turned their blurred background off, it's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I'd much rather know that you're, I don't know, not in a hostage situation or something. I don't know what the blurred background thing. Maybe don't say that.
No, it's fine. I do think the blurred background thing is a bit of a hang-up about professionalism in the workplace. That's my take on it. Like, when I see people do it, I work with people who do it. Like, they don't want to share that much of themselves because they've created a space in their home that is theirs, and they don't necessarily want to share that with the world. And actually, that leads on to what I was going to ask you about authenticity around this stuff, because one of the challenges I think you get in this kind of social comms and the influencer way of thinking about it, if you starting putting production into the way in which you communicate, you run a risk very quickly about it becoming inauthentic, because all of a sudden it's more scripted, you're thinking more carefully about your messaging, it becomes less you, right? How do you go about combating that for the people you work with?
Scripting's an interesting one, because everyone we've worked with in this space kind of assumes that scripting and preparing for a video is the answer, and it's like it's not, which is why when we talk about the leadership skills inside an organization, getting yourself on video more, it's like, actually, the skill you should learn first is live streaming, not creating user-generated content, because you have no option but to record a conversation or a presentation as you would in person. So, for example, if we were to try and make this a staged video, this podcast, it wouldn't work.
No.
So to try and do the same as a leader with your video content isn't going to work. So how can you create that space to be able to do it authentically? And the easiest way to do that is by live streaming, because there's literally nowhere to hide. You press go live, or you enter your Zoom call or your Teams call, and you're there for an hour. And it's like, how can you create conversation and two-way communication with your audience?
I think it comes down to, would you prepare for a conversation? If it was in real life, how would you prepare for it? And then doing it in that same way. Because not everybody is blessed with just being able to speak really, really smoothly straight away. some of us have to practice our talking points, or like have it like in a certain way that you want to write it down, say, or you want to say, okay, this is what I want to say, these are the main points that I want to get out. But then I'm not going to read a script, I'm not going to learn a script. I've just made the points in my head that I know what I want to say, and then it will come more naturally. And maybe I've got some phrasing that I've kind of been through a couple of times.
It might be a hook or something you want to use.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
This is a particular point. I've really got to get the words exactly right. Maybe you do that.
Exactly. But just to counter that, not everyone is brilliant at just making stuff up on the fly.
No, so I'm really good at making stuff up on the fly. I think it's quite a big
Yeah,
told.
is that what's going on here? So you mentioned though about the live streaming. How do you then ensure that someone is thinking about it authentically, and how do you bring someone's authentic self into that skill set? Because I think that, like you said, I think there's a real spectrum I see there. Like, but it'd be very easy for you to sort of drift into being the person you think you should be versus the person you are.
I think Emily does this really well. So there is that element of being a human on a call where you allow the time and space for that informal chat that would happen if you were in a meeting room. Like, it'd be very weird if this was a meeting for us to kind of all sit down and go, hello, everybody, welcome to the meeting. What I'd like to discuss is just the Q3 financial results. So if you have any questions, we'll take those at the end. Like, you wouldn't run a meeting like that. That would be insanity.
I have been in some meetings like that, but okay. That's fine. They're not great. They weren't great.
And I'll look at the camera for this point. So if you're a leader that does that, get in touch. So that would be just pure insanity. So if you look at how a live stream turns up, right? One of the first things they do is engage the audience and get them to interact in chat. That's the first thing they do. The Gara Show is great at this. He's been running training sessions for us, and he will do a 2-hour training session, but he runs it like a live stream. And we didn't really even ask him to do that. He just started doing them like that. And you're like, this is actually insane that you're running these way better than some facilitators, L&D professionals we know, that would host a 2-hour session. But that's because he keeps it informal. He lets the conversation flow two ways. He doesn't kind of go, oh, there's a question in chat, we'll come back to that in 10 minutes. He answers it there and then. He gets people, and then people respect the chat more, that they respect that they have a voice in that room. They're not just being talked at and they have to wait for a moment in time to interact. It's like, this is two-way.
Yeah, it's the more democratic.
Yeah.
Which absolutely leads into that authenticity, which is really important. I think the other thing that you're asking, how do you make sure you're not becoming someone that you don't want to be? I mean, that's quite a deep question.
So I recognise there's a can of worms there.
It is a little bit, but I think I don't think that how you show up as a leader is, certainly in a remote setting, is any different from being a leader that maybe you don't, or turning into someone you don't want to be in an in-person setting. So ignoring that can of worms aside, it's literally just being yourself, like being the person that you are. And we all have work personas, which are slightly different from our home personas, but it's being that work persona and being like, right, am I being true to myself? Like, is this what I would say? Just don't try and be someone you're not. Don't try and be, I don't know, don't try and be Mark Zuckerberg. Don't try and be, definitely
advice.
Don't try and be Mark Zuckerberg.
He's had a real glow up lately, old Zuck. I'm just throwing that out there. Like,
from an aesthetic perspective.
I think from a PR perspective as well, he's put a lot of work into that.
Okay, but don't try and be like, I'm really struggling to think of big leaders and all I've got in my head is Boris Johnson. Definitely don't try and be Boris Johnson. Don't try and be like Steve Jobs, just be who you are.
Well, and that's where it's like you can't script it. I go back to that one. It's like you can't plan and script it to within an inch of its life because you will be inauthentic unless, as a leader, you're a professional broadcaster.
Right.
There aren't many leaders I've worked with who would be any good on TV in any role.
Fair.
Even being interviewed, some of them, to be honest.
Okay. But that makes sense though, right? If that's your... I think the reason I ask it is not through, like, I haven't got a fear of it in and of myself. I think that one of the things people struggle with when we talk about authenticity at work is, like, who am I and who do I want to be? And who... Excuse me. You mentioned about, like, your work personas, for example. Like, there's a lot of negative press that goes with things like masking, for example, and, like, showing up in, like, having to be a certain way, and or, like I used to talk about, like, corporate Ted versus real life Ted when I used to work in corporate. And it was a complex, like, thing to actually balance. Like, what's the right thing? Who wants what from the experience of Ted when I show up? Like, what do people expect? As I've grown older, I think there is just a balance. Like, I think your answer was particularly poignant about, like, just what would I actually say, think, or do. Like that seems to be the general lens. Like, and not all the time. Like my first instinct is usually to say something funny, but like that's not always appropriate. Like in the corporate sense, but I think maybe rather than necessarily worrying about the authenticity piece, I guess, like, I'd ask you guys, actually, if someone's trying to be a more authentic leader through this sort of remote leadership piece, is there a piece of advice you would give people? Is there like a thing you would think about?
I've got one.
Go on, hit me.
I take it from stand-up comedy. Quite a few, I'm not going to say all, but effective stand-up comedians, one of the first things they do when they'll get on stage is do a self-deprecating joke.
Yeah, okay.
And that, if you just go to next time you go to a stand-up night, look at the comedians that do and don't that, and then do and don't that. Look at the comedians that do that, and then look at the comedians that don't, and look how the audience changes their engagement with them. The ones that do often get a lot warmer reception from the crowd, not only at that point, but then throughout. Whereas if you don't get that at the start, then you're kind of trying to bring them back in. So it comes to that level of like self-awareness. You know, if you've got your blurred background on, make a joke about it, because everyone's kind of going, what you hide? Everyone is thinking, what are you hiding?
Yeah.
So being self-aware enough to just have a bit of self-deprecating humour, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be humour, but it is that level of self-awareness that, do you know what your people are thinking about you as a stand-up comedian when you get on stage, as a leader when you get into a meeting, either online or in person?
I don't know. See, I also think that it's not just about you as a leader, it's actually about the people that you're leading, and so stop focusing on you, stop worrying about you so much. I think there's a real element of that.
That's it. That's particularly. So I had Nick, my CEO. I had an interesting conversation with him about tattoos recently. He's got a lot of tattoos. He's a punk. If you've not, of course you know Nick. But he's comes from that kind of mindset and is just coated in the things. But when he goes to certain meetings, he feels obligated to cover them up. And I've said this to him before. I'm like, that doesn't seem you at all, man. Like, it's not really authentic. But his point really was, look, some of the companies we deal with and some of the clients we work with, they're conceivably not going to mind it long term. But for that first meeting, that's not the impression I want to give them. And because I am responsible for you and for all the other people who work for the People Experience Hub getting paid and being well looked after and having a good place to work, and this contract that we might win or this impression that I leave could have some impact on that, I feel not obligated to be inauthentic to myself, but my actual... The onus is on me to do a great job here, and I don't want that to detract from it. And actually, it was the most authentic thing he could have said, in my opinion. Like, it was just it's very easy to be like, just be authentic, just be yourself, right? But it's actually not about that. It's about thinking, like, what is my responsibility, and how do I want people to experience me? And what's the level, like, what's the real me I want them to experience? And Nick's thing there isn't about going, the real me isn't just tattoos, because it's not. Sometimes it's the first thing, like, first impressions matter, and sometimes it's the thing people see and latch onto. Once they get to know him, he's just like, I'm covered in this and that, and I got, he's chill with it. But I do think that was a really interesting way of seeing it. It's not about hiding yourself; it's more about understanding the thing that you want people to get from you.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it depends how big the company is, I guess, as well, right? Because I know plenty of people that are, it's them, they run the company is them. So the brand is their company and they are the company, and all this kind of, like, the two are indistinguishable. Yeah. Whereas what you might not necessarily want to get to certain sizes, that your leaders are the brand of the company, if that makes sense. That wouldn't make too much. That would seem inauthentic, that they are. Nick is the People Experience Hub.
He is in a lot of ways.
Well, he is, but he's got, like he said, he's
bigger
got
than him now.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's got to be lived and breathed through him and other people. So he's representing the company, the people that work for that company, and so he has to be authentic in a multifaceted way rather than a two-dimensional way. If it was just Nick Corp, then it would be very different, right? Which
he used to do, but I think it had a better name than that. But I digress. Look, we're coming towards the end of our time together, which has flown, as it always does, I'm afraid. I always like to sort of finish up with sort of like, I guess, like final thoughts, or I usually actually, a nice way to think about it is advice you might have given your younger self. Because it sounds like you guys have been on a real journey with understanding, like, not just like how businesses can measure things like outputs and inputs and the mutual values and all that sort of stuff. I guess, like, from where you sit today, if there's a piece of advice you could either give to your younger selves or to the people listening at home, what might it be?
I, much like probably most of the people who listen to this, have a lot of imposter syndrome a lot of the time, have a lot of like self-doubt. I've worked through a lot of it. So I think my advice to my younger self would just be believe in yourself. I mean, literally don't let the haters get you down. You know, like one door closes, another door opens, all this kind of cheesy stuff that I've heard, but like it really is true. I think that's what I would say. Like it really is true. There are opportunities everywhere. Don't panic. You got this. Probably.
Okay, I like that. That's a cool one.
You asked us before the podcast record. I don't want to shatter the illusion that this I'm going to break the third wall.
Don't be so inauthentic, Toby.
Yeah. Hey guys, so here's my really inspirational quote about what I would say to my younger self. So what would I flippantly said, don't work in HR. So
that's where we start.
So that's been sat in the old noodle box for about 40 minutes now, and I don't know whether I agree with it or not, but like everything that we've talked about is taking concepts that have lived and breathed outside the world of work for like 10, 15 years, and therefore they should be living and breathing inside the workplace, but that it's such a slow process of bringing those things in. So society is like going like that outside the world of work, and society inside the world of work is like going and toddling to keep up. So it's like, would I have a better time in my life doing those really cool things outside the world of work, like, you know, like marketing, influencer marketing, all that kind of stuff? Should I have just done that instead of in HR? And then I kind of go, probably not, because there's an opportunity, right, to make the world of work better, and we spend a lot of time doing it. So, yeah, I don't know if that is advice to my former self. I know it's just like a quick chat with myself, maybe, that it's going to be all right.
It's all going to be all right on the night?
All the day.
All the day.
Yeah, the whole week.
Wonderful. Toby, Emily, thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Thanks,
Thank
Ted.
you.